They asked Jimi to play louder. But what he gave them instead was more powerful than any note, and the 200 people in that room never listened to music the same way again. The venue was small. A club in Greenwich Village, 1968. Not the kind of place where legends are supposed to be made. Wooden floors. Low ceilings. Maybe 200 people packed shoulder to shoulder, most of them musicians themselves, guitarists who'd come to see what all the talk was about. Jimi Hendrix was already famous by then. Are You Experienced had changed everything. But fame hadn't changed him. He still played these small rooms sometimes, unannounced, just walking in off the street and asking if he could sit in for a set. Tonight was one of those nights. The owner of the club, a man named Vincent who'd been running the place for 15 years, had nearly dropped his clipboard when Jimi walked through the door at 9 p.m. carrying his Stratocaster in a battered case. "You playing tonight?" Vincent asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Jimi shrugged. "If that's all right." It was more than all right. Within 20 minutes, word had spread through the village. By 10 p.m., the club was packed beyond capacity. People standing against walls. Sitting on the floor near the tiny stage. Pressed together in the darkness, waiting. The house band, 3 local musicians who played blues covers most nights, had been told to take a break. They stood at the bar now, trying not to look nervous. The guitarist among them, a young man named Michael, gripped his beer bottle and wondered if he should even keep playing after tonight. What was the point? Hendrix was about to show everyone what a guitar could really do. Jimi took the stage without fanfare. No introduction. No announcement. He just stepped up, plugged in his Stratocaster, adjusted the amplifier settings with quick, practiced movements, and began to play. The sound was immediate and overwhelming. Not loud, not yet, but complete. Every note seemed to occupy the entire room, filling spaces that other guitarists didn't even know existed. His fingers moved across the fretboard with liquid precision, bending notes that shouldn't bend, finding harmonics that shouldn't exist. The audience stood transfixed. This was what they'd come for. This was the legend made flesh, Hendrix doing things with 6 strings that defied explanation. He played for maybe 10 minutes. A blues progression that he twisted and reinvented in real time, never playing the same phrase twice, building layers of sound that seemed impossible from a single guitar. And then Vincent made his mistake. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. The club owner had been standing near the small mixing board at the back of the room. He'd been in the music business long enough to know what audiences wanted. Volume. Energy. Spectacle. And while Hendrix was brilliant, Vincent thought he was holding back. Playing too controlled. Too restrained. During a brief pause between songs, Vincent leaned toward the stage and called out, loud enough for Jimi to hear over the ambient noise. "Jimi! Give us more! Turn it up! Let's really hear what that guitar can do!" Other voices joined in. "Yeah! Louder! Crank it up, Jimi!" The audience was eager. They wanted the full Hendrix experience. They wanted their ears to ring. They wanted to tell their friends they'd seen Jimi Hendrix blow the roof off a club in the village. Jimi looked up from his guitar. His expression didn't change. He scanned the room slowly, taking in the faces, the expectations, the hunger for more, more, more. Then he did something no one expected. He turned his amplifier down. Not off. Just down. Significantly down. Until the guitar was barely louder than a conversation. The room stirred. Confused murmurs rippled through the crowd. What was he doing? This wasn't what they'd asked for. This wasn't what they'd come to see. Vincent looked bewildered. Michael, the local guitarist at the bar, leaned forward, trying to understand what was happening. Jimi adjusted his guitar strap, positioned his fingers on the fretboard, and began to play again. But this time, everything was different. The notes came soft, delicate. Each one articulated with such precision that you could hear the individual harmonics within it. The sound of his fingers sliding against the strings became part of the music. The tiny imperfections, the breath between notes, the subtle shift in pressure, all of it suddenly audible. He wasn't playing louder. He was playing clearer. And the room began to change. People stopped moving. Conversations died mid-sentence. The rustling of clothing, the shuffle of feet, all of it ceased as 200 people collectively held their breath and listened. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. He closed his eyes. Not in performance. Not for show. But in genuine concentration, as if the audience had disappeared and he was alone with the instrument, exploring something private and profound. His playing became a conversation, the guitar asking questions, his fingers answering. He found spaces between the notes that most guitarists rush past. He let silence do as much work as sound. Each pause carried as much weight as each phrase. And people began to hear things they never heard before. Michael, the local guitarist, felt something crack open in his chest. He'd been playing guitar for 8 years. He'd learned scales. He'd practiced speed. He'd worked on his volume and his tone and his stage presence. But he'd never thought about this. About space. About restraint. About the power of what you don't play. Across the room, a woman named Sarah, a music journalist who'd covered dozens of rock concerts, found tears running down her face. She'd come expecting pyrotechnics. She'd expected Hendrix to prove he was the loudest, the fastest, the most technically brilliant. Instead, he was showing her that brilliance didn't need volume. It needed honesty. Vincent, the club owner who'd asked for more, stood frozen at the mixing board. His hand hovered near the volume controls but didn't move. He understood, suddenly and with crushing clarity, that he'd been asking for the wrong thing. More volume wouldn't have made this better. It would have destroyed it. Jimi played for another 7 minutes like this. Soft. Intimate. Every person in the room leaning forward, straining to catch each note, suddenly aware of their own breathing, their own heartbeat, the way sound moves through air and enters the body. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. When he finished, there was no final flourish. No dramatic ending. He just let the last note fade into silence, and stood there for a moment, eyes still closed, feeling the resonance decay. The silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. 15. No one moved. No one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, because they were too moved. The applause would have felt like a violation of what had just happened. Finally, someone in the back started clapping. Slowly. Deliberately. Not the wild applause of excitement, but the reverent applause of recognition. Others joined. Not a roar but a wave of quiet acknowledgement that they'd just witnessed something rare. Jimi opened his eyes. He looked at the crowd with that same unchanged expression, calm, present, slightly distant. He unplugged his guitar without a word, tucked it under his arm, and walked off the tiny stage. Vincent tried to stop him. Jimi, wait! Man, I didn't mean. Jimi paused. Turned back. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. You asked for louder? I gave you clearer? There's a difference. He left through the back door. Vincent stood there, those words echoing in his head like an indictment of every choice he'd made in 15 years of running a music venue. Michael, the local guitarist, set down his beer and walked out into the street. He stood on the sidewalk in the cold November air, and realized he needed to go home and unlearn almost everything he thought he knew about playing. Sarah, the music journalist, filled 3 pages of her notebook that night. But when her editor asked for the story, she couldn't write it. How do you describe the moment when someone shows you that everything you thought mattered doesn't matter at all? The owner of the club never asked another musician to play louder. Ever. He told the story sometimes, usually late at night, to musicians he thought might understand. Hendrix taught me, he'd say. That volume is what you do when you don't have anything to say. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. Michael stopped playing in clubs for 6 months. He sat in his apartment and relearned the guitar from scratch, not as an instrument of volume or speed, but as an instrument of space and intention. Years later, when he became a respected session musician, he'd tell young guitarists, "The loudest thing Jimi Hendrix ever played was silence." Sarah eventually wrote her article. Not for a magazine but for herself. She kept it in a drawer for 30 years. When she finally showed it to someone, it was to her granddaughter, who was learning piano and getting frustrated that she wasn't progressing fast enough. Sarah gave her the article and said, "Read this. It's not about guitar. It's about listening." Vincent kept the club running for another 25 years. He never forgot that night. Sometimes, when a musician would ask to turn up their volume, he'd shake his head and tell them about Jimi Hendrix playing so quietly you could hear his fingers slide across the strings. Most of them didn't understand. A few did. Those were the ones Vincent remembered. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The lesson wasn't about guitar technique. It wasn't about music theory. It was about the difference between making noise and making meaning. Jimi Hendrix never came back to that club. But his presence never left. The space where he'd stood on that tiny stage, people swore it felt different afterward. Like he'd changed the molecular structure of the room just by showing everyone what was possible when you stopped trying to be loud and started trying to be clear. Real mastery isn't about drowning out everyone else. It's about making people stop, lean in, and listen to what's actually being said. That night in Greenwich Village, 200 people learned that lesson. And some of them spent the rest of their lives trying to play that quietly, that clearly, that true. But there was one person in the room whose story didn't end that night, it began. In the back corner, barely visible in the dim light, sat a 16-year-old kid named David. He'd snuck in with a fake ID, his heart pounding with the fear of being caught and the thrill of seeing Jimi Hendrix live. He'd saved for 3 months to buy his first electric guitar, a cheap Harmony model that his older brother said wasn't worth the money. David had come to see Hendrix destroy that guitar. He'd heard the stories, Jimi setting his Stratocaster on fire at Monterey, smashing guitars on stage, playing with his teeth. David wanted to see chaos. He wanted permission to be wild. What he got instead was the opposite. When Jimi turned the volume down, David felt something shift inside him. He'd been practicing speed runs in his bedroom for hours every night, trying to play faster than his fingers could manage, pushing volume until his mother banged on the wall. He thought that's what guitar was, aggression and velocity and proving you could do what others couldn't. But watching Hendrix play barely above a whisper, seeing 200 people lean forward in complete silence to hear every note, David understood something he'd spent decades unpacking. The point wasn't to be heard over everyone else. The point was to make people want to listen. He left that club and walked 12 blocks to the Hudson River. Sat on a bench until dawn. Went home and sold his amplifier, the one he'd been saving for, the one that could really crank it. Bought a smaller one. Started practicing differently. Not faster. Clearer. Not louder. More intentional. 40 years later, David became a guitar teacher in Brooklyn. He never became famous. Never played stadiums. Never set anything on fire. But every student who walked into his small studio saw the same thing on his wall, a photograph of Jimi Hendrix, and beneath it, a single sentence written in careful handwriting. He taught me that the hardest thing to play is silence. His students would ask about technique. About speed. About getting noticed. And David would tell them about a night in 1968, when the greatest guitarist in the world turned his amplifier down and changed everything. "You want to know the secret?" David would say, holding his guitar but not playing it yet. "The secret is that everyone can make noise. Noise is easy. But making someone stop everything they're doing just to hear what you're saying, that takes mastery. That takes courage. That takes knowing yourself so well that you don't need volume to prove you exist." Some students got it. Some didn't. The ones who got it, Those were the ones who learned that music isn't about conquering the silence. It's about respecting it, honoring it, making peace with the fact that the spaces between notes matter as much as the notes themselves. And every time David told the story, he remembered the way Jimi had looked at that crowd. Not with contempt for asking him to play louder, but with patience. Like a teacher who understands that some lessons can't be explained. They can only be demonstrated. The club in Greenwich Village closed in 1994. The building was torn down to make room for luxury condos. But the people who were there that night, the ones still alive, they carry that room with them. That moment. That lesson. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is loud and demanding and insisting that more is better, they remember what it felt like to hear Jimi Hendrix play so quietly that you could hear your own heartbeat between the notes. That's not music. That's mastery.